The huge wave of missiles and drones launched by Iran was simultaneously unprecedented and carefully calibrated. Regional countries warned, allowing Israel and its allies plenty of time to prepare, shooting nearly all of them down. Minor damage to a military base and one young Bedouin girl badly injured, the only impact. Before the drones had even reached their target, Iran announced it considers this chapter over. Israel doesn't. The head of the army speaking to troops today, promising there would be a response, as the war cabinet met to decide what that will look like, amidst fears of a regional war breaking out. Iran's assault was retaliation for this Israeli strike in Damascus, killing several senior Revolutionary Guard commanders in an Iranian consular building. An attack, in other words, on Iranian soil that dangerously upped the ante in the conflict between the two nations, more often fought out with Iran's network of proxy forces, the axis of resistance. Today, calls on Israel to show restraint from the US and others who came to its aid over the weekend.
Israel has a right to respond, but we are urging them that we respond with head as well as heart, that we're smart as well as tough. And actually the right thing to do is recognise that Iran has suffered a double defeat. Defeat because their attack was an almost total failure, and defeat because the rest of the world can now see they are the aggressor. They are the malign influence in this region.
Around a third of the drones, ballistic and cruise missiles was shot down by the US, British, French and Jordanian forces. Other Arab countries reportedly passed on key intelligence. Their eyes now are on what Israel does next. No one internationally wants to see a further escalation. Some form of military response does seem inevitable, but worn down by months of conflict, many ordinary people in Israel don't want more violence.
I think Iran did it just to save face. You know, he said he's going to do this and he did actually really nothing. And we are secure enough to not to have to retaliate and just, first of all, just get our hostages back.
I hope they'll make it, and I hope government will punish them forever.
Because if not, you're worried?
Yeah, for sure Israel will be weak. And if we are weak in our area, we will get trouble from all the area.
I really hope that Bibi gonna listen to all what everybody's saying and to Biden, and we're not gonna attack Iraq or Iran, sorry, and we're gonna have a quiet and peaceful years to come because we really need it to grow up.
What happened in 7 October?
I understand exactly.
No, you don't hear it. I see what you're dreaming.
One second.
Deep political divisions within Israel that had largely disappeared in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th are re-emerging once again. Israel has already been trading strikes with Hezbollah, Iran's closest ally, since the outset of the war, though both sides are holding back firepower. Will Israel make fighters here or in Syria, Iraq or Yemen their target? Or will they strike Iran itself, where pro-regime crowds cheered the missiles, but the regime fears an all-out war? For years, some Israeli politicians have pushed for greater military action targeting Iran's nuclear program. That would surely trigger another Iranian attack.
If the international community and the Security Council had reacted to Israel's aggression in the past years, we would not have seen such bold acts by this regime now. We've carried out this action in the framework of deterrence. If Israel responds, our actions will be more serious.
Amidst all the talk of the dangers of a regional war beginning, a reminder of how awful the violence already raging in Gaza continues to be. Palestinians forced to flee the north have been trying to return to their homes, though Israel has said it still won't allow them back.
We've been living in tents, but we just want to return to our homes, even just the rubble of our homes. We just want to live. My children, how is it their fault? What have they done to deserve this? This is sinful. By God, it's sinful. They need to have some consideration for us.
Talks on a ceasefire had already been faltering, with Hamas rejecting Israel's latest proposal. And for now, there's greater international urgency in preventing the war spreading than in ending the bloodshed in Gaza.
And Secunda joins us now live from Tel Aviv. Secunda.
Well, Krish, I think it's quite striking how up until this Iranian attack, in the aftermath of that deadly Israeli drone strike on aid workers from the World Central Kitchen, there seemed to be a growing international consensus that Israel's war in Gaza needed to come to an end as soon as possible. Then we saw on Saturday night this barrage of missiles and drones fired from Iran, and the conversation changed. America, European countries, even a number of Arab countries, either covertly or overtly, coming out in support of Israel's defense. One theory is that's exactly what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to happen when he launched that strike in Damascus. Other theories being that Israel was trying to test Iran's resolve and see how far they could push them, sensing weakness, or that Israel's been trying to dissuade Iran away from this strategy of supporting proxy forces that are battling against Israel. But now the ball is very firmly in Israel's court. The media here are reporting that the War Cabinet today discussed a number of proposals that they say would hurt Iran, but that would fall short of provoking all-out war. You can easily imagine, though, how one retaliatory strike is met by another, is met by another, is met by another. And what's clear is that this conflict between Iran and Israel that's been so often in the shadows is now very much in the open, and it's reached dangerous new heights.
Thanks, Secunda. Well, I'm joined now by Ehud Olmert, the former Prime Minister of Israel. Good evening. Why do you think now is the time for Netanyahu to stop?
I think that Saturday night was a very important night for Israel and the supporters of Israel. We defeated the Iranians. They were shooting at us 120 ballistic missiles, maybe close to 200 UAVs and many cruise missiles, and all of them were shot down. We humiliated Iran, we defeated Iran, and there is no need for us to continue. That's as simple as that. This is not something that has to be settled on a daily basis. I entirely subscribe to what Lord Cameron said about it. Iran proved to be the aggressor. Israel was supported comprehensively in an admirable manner, I have to say, by the President of America, by Prime Minister Sunak, by President Macron, by the Chancellor Scholz, and many others, and including Arab countries. And we fought back, and we exposed to the entire world that the Iranians are arrogant, but when it comes down to the real thing, we can defend ourselves together with our friends, and we did it in a very impressive manner, and we don't need now to continue. If the need will arise in some time in the future, if the Iranians will provoke in some way that will endanger the security of the state of Israel, we have time, we'll be able to work it out, to coordinate it with our friends, and to do what needs to be done. But at this moment, right now, there is no need for it. And the same goes for the Gaza operation. I think we have reached a point
well, that's
where
what I was going to ask you.
What we need to do now is to bring the hostages back. That's the most important. This is the most fundamental moral obligation that the government of Israel has to its citizens, which were abducted from their homes, living rooms, bedrooms, safe rooms, in where they live. And I don't see any great advantage of continuing the confrontation in Gaza, which may result in a couple of hundred more terrorists killed, in some Israeli soldiers killed, and in many non-involved Palestinians killed, which we certainly don't want it to happen. So at this point now, I think we have devastated the Hamas. We have destroyed their bunkers, their tunnels. We killed more than 12,000 of their fighters. It's a very impressive military achievement. And right now, there is not any great merit in continuing. Instead, what we have to do is to bring back the hostages.
But you know that there is a demand for retaliation. I mean, you heard them in Sekunder's report, people saying, well, if we don't hit back, people will think Israel is weak, Iran will be able to do this again, and just as the rockets from Gaza have become a normal, missiles from Iran could also become a normal.
You know, I'm familiar with these arguments that come from the extremist messianic groups that are anxious to have a comprehensive confrontation that may help them to achieve their crazy goals of kicking out the Palestinians from where they are and taking over the territories that are occupied by Palestinians. I'm not part of it, and the majority of the Israelis are not part of it. And all these arguments that we have proved Saturday night how strong we are. It's true that we were assisted by your country, by the way, and by America and by others. But I think it's well established that 80% of the missiles and the rockets were intercepted by the different technologies that Israel developed, the Iron Dome, the David Sting, the Arrow missile, and we know how to deal with them. And there are those who are trying to create an atmosphere of hysteria and panic in Israel. I'm not part of it. I think that what we need to do now is to replace our government and to go for early elections so that there will be a government in Israel that will establish a serious process of negotiations with the Palestinians to try and resolve once and for all the political disputes that we have here.
Ehud Olmert, thank you very much for joining us. So how did Israel manage to fend off Iran's unprecedented attack so comprehensively? Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Porrick O'Brien has been taking a closer look.
Tehran dubbed it Operation Honest Promise. Waves of drones and missiles launched at Israel over 5 hours. How many of them reached their target, though? Honestly, hardly any. So, did Iran underestimate Israeli defences, or was a large degree of failure factored in from the start? The attack started with 170 drones launched from Iran towards Israel. An hour later, the UAVs were joined by over 30 cruise missiles that can reach Israel in just over an hour. Finally, over 120 ballistic missiles, which take just between 10 and 15 minutes to arrive. At the same time, drone attacks were launched by the Houthis in Yemen and Iran-backed militias in Iraq, while Hezbollah fired missiles at Israeli positions in the Golan Heights. But Israel's missile defense systems, plus a combined air effort from Israel, the US, the UK, France and Jordan, meant none of the drones or cruise missiles even reached Israeli airspace, with the majority intercepted over Iraq and Syria. Like the remnants of this missile found in northern Iraq. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard said the operation was more successful than expected, which begs the question, what were they expecting? On the streets of Tehran over the weekend, fireworks of an altogether less lethal variety, as some celebrated the fact that the attack was launched, although ultimately foiled. Its limited impact thanks to two things: nearly 40 years of investment in Israel's anti-missile defense systems underwritten by the US, and close cooperation between Israel and its allies in the air. Those missiles that made it past the Allied Air Force efforts faced a three-tier defense system. First up, the long-range Arrow system. It was designed specifically with Iranian missiles in mind. Each of these systems' rockets costs a few $1 million each. They can intercept missiles outside the Earth's atmosphere, resulting in these distinctive purple explosions seen on Saturday. The second layer of defense, the so-called David Sling system, is for taking out missiles and drones. And finally, the Iron Dome, which stops most short-range rocket attacks. Israel said that the systems combined meant that 99% of last Saturday's attack was intercepted. But some of Iran's ballistic missiles did get through. The ones that did show that one of the targets of the attack was the Nevatim airbase in southern Israel. That's where Israel keeps its fleet of F-35 jets. Israel says the damage to the base was minimal and didn't affect the runway. Iran said it had warned countries about the attack 72 hours beforehand, although US officials said it hadn't got a heads up in advance. As Israel contemplates its response now, one of the questions to consider: was this Iran looking to demonstrate power or to get more directly involved in this war?
Well, let's just get the UK government's response now. Over to London and Matt.
Thanks, Chris. Well, congratulating the RAF personnel who were involved in the US-led mission to help Israel down the barrage of missiles fired from Iran. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak told MPs earlier that the UK's aim was to prevent further destabilisation in the Middle East. And he also urged an end to the conflict in Gaza, calling on Israel to improve the amount of aid reaching there. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
Iran's first direct attack on Israel brought Britain's first military action in defence of Israel. Rishi Sunak, speaking after RAF jets shot down an undisclosed number of Iranian drones, echoed President Biden's ironclad commitment to Israel.
We must ensure Israel's security. That is non-negotiable. It is a fundamental condition for peace in the region.
Rishi Sunak said he hoped to speak to Israel's Prime Minister soon. Will RAF involvement in Israel's defence this weekend mean his voice carries more impact?
We want to see calmer heads prevail. All sides must show restraint.
The Prime Minister will be hoping, when he has an imminent phone call with Benjamin Netanyahu, that this cooperation over the weekend buys him a bit more influence, some leverage with the Israeli Prime Minister. Realistically, though, is that how it'll be?
I think that will be limited. Now, I think where it does buy some leverage is that the PM and the Foreign Secretary are able to say to Netanyahu, look, you don't need to act unilaterally against Iran now. You don't need to go for this military approach because we showed you that when you were under attack, the most sophisticated defense system in the world stood up, and that we stood up behind you too.
Keir Starmer suggested the government should have condemned Israel's attack on Iran's consulate in Damascus, which provoked the Iranian missile and drone attacks.
If diplomacy takes centre stage, and it must, then we also need to be clear: diplomatic premises should not be targeted and attacked. That is a point of principle.
Keir Starmer supported the RAF action and the calls for restraint in the region.
We have proscribed Hamas. We have proscribed Hezbollah. Prime Minister, why don't we put the UK's national security first by now prescribing the IRGC?
Mr. Speaker, as the Right Honourable Lady knows, that we don't comment on any potential prescription decisions.
Government sources say a ban on Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard risks severing useful diplomatic contact with Iran. But it's hoping to join international efforts to increase sanctions on Tehran. The RAF distributing aid to Gaza a week ago. No footage has been shared of the RAF Typhoons engaged in their unprecedented mission at the weekend in defence of Israel. Did we just watch Britain develop a new arm to its foreign policy in going in to protect Israel's borders? Nobody can point to a treaty where that's written down.
If we want to be at the table with the Americans, trying to come up with the solutions to these really tricky regional crises, then we have to also be ready to answer the call for real practical support when it comes. It's part of the deal, I think, for being in that conversation.
How Britain would respond if asked to engage again after Israeli retaliation is a question Rishi Sunak hopes he can head off with his message of restraint.
Gary Gibbon reporting. Well, let's get the Iranian response now. Joining me from Tehran is Tauhid Asadi, a professor at the University of Tehran. Thank you for joining us. The Israelis hit your consulate in Syria and killed very senior military officers. Iran sent hundreds of missiles and drones to Israel, killed nobody and destroyed very little. How was this a success in Iranian terms?
Well, the truth is that the Israeli regime has started and has continued a sort of destabilizing behavior, and Iran is responding, but not to this one instance of the attack that they made against the Iranian consulate, but to a series of obnoxious behavior, including assassination of Iranian top military advisor Sayyid Reza Mousavi in Damascus, the cyber attacks that took place months ago in Iran, and latest of which we can refer to the attack that you mentioned. These are sort of things that are triggering by nature. Therefore, Iran tried to practice sort of strategic patience up until, let's say, the recent retaliatory action that it made. The truth is that Iran is not willing to escalate the situation, knowing the fact that it runs the risk of dragging the entire West Asia into a full-fledged war. At all events, it was supposed to sort of respond, but decided to keep it at a very limited level. I think the extent to which it is successful or not is one story, because there are different reports. Iranians are saying that between 50 to 70% of the targets are hit, but Israelis are saying that it's just
that's clearly not true.
I'm not in a position to say what is true, but based on the reports and based on the coverage that I'm observing and I'm following in these days, that 99% is also wrong. But the thing is that we're not here dealing with these numbers. It was a clear slap in the face of the Israelis, which may not have anticipated such a response. And this is A. And B,
no, I think it's true to say that they didn't anticipate so many missiles. And many Israelis tonight are saying the intent of Iran was to kill. That this was not just some symbolic military action. There were ballistic missiles, and Iran would not have expected such a successful missile defense operation in Israel. And that's why there's a demand for retaliation. Now, if there is an Israeli military response, what happens then?
First things first, let's agree to disagree, because so far as what I've heard from the Iranian side, this attack from Iranian perspective was limited because of the fact that they didn't intend to harm any person, because it was intended to be symbolic. And Iran said also that there is going to be a severe consequence down the road if any response is received from Israeli side. And last point related to this is that Iran did not use its full missile capacity, knowing that, as I told you, it could drag to an uncontrollable extent. But when it comes to any sort of response from the Israeli regime, now Iran is stating and putting emphasis on its full preparedness to respond. Again, it's saying repeatedly that it has no intention to further escalate the situation. Let's keep in mind, it was a retaliatory action to a series of hostile behaviors of the Israelis. What happens if a third country, if any country attacks one of your consulates, one of UK consulates? Of course, UK is expected domestically and internationally to respond. And Iran knew how to play by the rule of diplomacy. Therefore, they knocked the door of the United Nations and Security Council, called for action.
Yeah, but 300 missiles is not the rule of diplomacy.
Of course, Iran tried the rule of diplomacy at first, but at the end of the day, it ended up nowhere. The Security Council, United Kingdom, United States, France, they decided to continue to support. They didn't even condemn this attack, let alone doing anything else. And then Iran came to this conclusion that if the trajectory of diplomacy does not work, it is supposed to respond in a different way in order to stop. Because just let's keep in mind, there is this perception inside Iran that it was not the first attack that Israelis made against Iran. It was a series, and if it didn't stop, then the Iranians expected to receive more and more let's say, hostile and obnoxious actions against them. So therefore, at some point, they came up to the conclusion that they should just respond in a very, let's say, physical, tangible manner in order to say that, yeah, there is this intention.
Professor Assadi, we must leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Matt.
Governments around the world are, of course, waiting with bated breath to see if Israel will heed the calls for restraint. President Biden has already warned the Israeli government that the US will not participate in any offensive action against Iran. Kieran Woodley is in Washington. Kieran.
Matt, I think you could say that this all questions that theory of American influence abroad. Firstly, does Joe Biden have any sway over Benjamin Netanyahu? Because we know in recent weeks he's been more critical of the Israeli Prime Minister, and he even said earlier in the month that America might even rethink its support for the war in Gaza unless Israel did more to protect civilians and aid workers. But now Netanyahu has pushed all that negativity aside, and the Americans have come back in line with Israel when it comes to this attack from Iran. And so, has Netanyahu played Joe Biden? And will Netanyahu listen to Joe Biden when he says Israel should not retaliate? Well, here's what the White House's John Kirby just said when he was asked about that.
This is an Israeli decision to make, whether and how they'll respond to what Iran did on Saturday, and we're going to leave it squarely with them.
Their decision to make, but are you making suggestions?
We are not involved in their decision-making process about a potential response.
Secondly, when it comes to American influence, it's really been restrained by the politics back here in Washington. Right now in Congress, there is a bill that will give more supplementary military aid to Israel. The Senate has passed it. Joe Biden wants to sign it, but it's been held up by the House. Why? That is because Israeli aid has been tied to Ukrainian aid, and some Republicans are opposed to that. Now, the Republican House Speaker has said that he will introduce a new bill this week just for the Israeli aid. But that probably won't pass because many politicians in the House and the Senate want it tied to support for Kyiv. And so what you have is we're stuck in the mud, the partisan mud of the Washington swamp, with two key American allies waiting for aid, and it's not coming. And so America's domestic divisions are meaning that America's influence abroad is being weakened. Back to you, Matt.
Kieran, thanks very much. Well, let's speak now to Mary Beth Long, a former US Assistant Secretary of Defense. Mary Beth Long, great to have you back on the program. So let's start with this rather blunt question. Has Benjamin Netanyahu played Joe Biden in all this?
I don't think so. I think the focus of the dynamics between the U.S. and Israel are interesting, but I think it's pretty clear in Washington, and I believe the spokesperson was accurate when the administration and I think the people here are waiting to see how Israel is going to respond, and that decision is hers.
And the president has been quite clear. First of all, he's asked for de-escalation, but he's also said if there's a unilateral response from Israel, America will not be any part of that. Does he actually mean that? And are the Israelis listening, do you think?
I think he absolutely means it. Now, that's not to say that if the Israelis were to come to us and say that they were designing perhaps a response that would attack one of the missile facilities or the launching facilities or the drone manufacturers, if they came to us and said we would like to reduce casualties or we would like to check our intel, I'm not clear that the U.S. would say no on that, particularly if it were couched in terms of a response that was calculated to go after a direct portion of the infrastructure that was part of the attack and designed to reduce casualties.
But if there is an attack by the Israelis, and we don't know if that's going to happen or at what level, and there's an immediate response from a country like Iran, then would America not get involved in that either?
It's all about proportionality and context. I believe that the U.S. and President Biden are keeping their options open, other than they are being clear, and I would take them at their word, that they will not be involved in offensive operations.
But really, the future of peace in the Middle East, the future, arguably, of this administration, the future possibly, of the election in November, hinges at the moment, really, on what one man and his cabinet in Tel Aviv decide to do. And that's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
It is. But it's also extraordinary that we find ourselves in this position. I think that were any other country, there would be not much debate about Israel's right or any other country's right to respond given the unbelievable assault of hundreds of missiles, of cruise missiles and of drones, only because the situation is so unique with Israel. Are we even contemplating some kind of input or constraints on the cabinet's decision-making?
If the American consulate or embassy in Mexico City had been flattened by an enemy missile, what would America do?
Well, I think that's a little bit of we would absolutely respond, but this wasn't a consulate. This was a facility, arguably on diplomatic grounds, that even the Iranians have just today admitted housed major members of the IRGC, one of whom was involved in the planning and the origination of the attacks against Israel on October 7th. I don't think there's many countries out there that would argue that they didn't have the right to take out that particular individual, given the ferocity of that attack against Israeli civilians.
And when the Iranians say, as there have been, that they've kind of sent their barrage of missiles and enough is enough, the jousting is over, does America believe them?
Absolutely not. No one should believe them. I think one does not send 300 plus ordnance-filled aviation to another country and claim after the fact because they failed, and only Iran knows how many of them actually didn't even make it off of Iranian airspace. But one doesn't claim that that was just for show. They failed.
Okay, just in 10 seconds, how afraid are you tonight that this thing will spread or not?
I don't think it'll spread in a way that's uncontrollable.
Okay, Mary Beth Long, thank you very much indeed.